Welcome back. All right, so we are a couple weeks away from, less than 2 weeks away from free agency. We're going to hear about how greedy all the players are. Greed, 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 greed. Not worth it, not worth it, not worth it. Now, anybody who wants to know how greedy players are, the book I would recommend, or even the movie if you can track it down, is Net Worth. Net Worth will tell you how the owners used to treat the players. And so I wanted to go through this because there's really a narrative out there that I think the owners are happy about it. I think the owners love it. The owners, anytime that there's a debate between owners and players on how much the players should be paid, owners will come out and say, or they'll send Gary Bettman out to say, man, they're going to bankrupt us. That's too much money. We can't afford that. And, we're going to have to put ticket prices up. We don't want to have to put ticket prices up. And we've seen this. This has been the playbook for decades, right? And people will buy it because they look at the money being made by players and say, well, that's too much. But if you look back to before the NHL had a union, and your top paid players back in, say, the 1930s might be 2.5 times the median income of a family in the US, which is good money, right? But that's your top players, and generally speaking, players weren't independently wealthy, and they didn't retire with tons and tons of cash to their name, and they didn't have anywhere near the benefits the players do now. What do you mean pension? You're not getting a pension. You're just not. And so eventually the players realized that they're kind of getting taken for a ride. And Ted Lindsay was the one that really understood they were being taken for a ride and pushed towards unionizing. And he really wanted to see the players come together, but the players didn't really agree on this. And the owners made sure that it stayed that way. So from 1957 through 1959 was the first time that the NHL players tried to unionize. And the owners did what they do. And I have been at workplaces that are union and workplaces that thought about becoming union. And as soon as you even have a conversation with somebody sitting next to you and say, we could always unionize. Somebody hears it, reports it to management, you get called in an office and told, yeah, if you unionize, you're all out of work. That's always the threat. If we unionize this place, we'll shut it. They'll shut it down. Head office will shut this location down, and they'll move it. Now, being in a union place, I know that unions do help when it comes to benefits. Unions do help when it comes to wages. And players understood this as well, right? And Ted Lindsay, Doug Harvey were the ones that were the leaders, right? And these are star players. Well, owners didn't like it. So what owners did was, well, Ted Lindsay got traded to the Hawks, which was just terrible for his career. And it was simply out of basically the owners saying, yeah, we need to send a message here. And other players who were involved in trying to unionize were sent to the minors. So, of course, you don't qualify as an NHLPA member if you're in the minors. So that solves that problem. And then for players who might be thinking about supporting unionization movements, they'd say, well, I've got a wife, I've got kids, I can't afford to try to unionize for maybe some extra money and end up in the minors where I'm not going to make any money, right? So this was a problem, right? Now, if you want to hear about all this, I've got the book Net Worth. I used it for some of this. If you haven't seen the movie, I would recommend that as well. It really gets into how basically players were treated like they were cattle. They were there to make money for the owners. They weren't really there to make money for themselves, and the owners had no intention of changing things. So these efforts went on for years, and the owners did their best to stifle it for years. And an out-of-court settlement with certain players led to disbanding the union. So basically, the owners paid off the right people and made it go away. Union's gone. That kept things as they were, and players were making, again, we're looking at $35,000, $40,000 a year, maybe $50,000 a year, until June of 1967. June of 1967, the union or team reps for each of the original six teams meet. Now, of course, we have six new teams coming in, league's doubling in size, and they met. They decided to make Bob Pulford their first president of their union, and Alan Eagleson became executive director. Now, I've done a video on Alan Eagleson. I'm not going to get into Alan Eagleson and all of the pitfalls of Eagleson, but maybe he was the one that kind of had to be involved to really make this work initially, as crooked as things were with him. And again, I've done videos on that. But immediately, Bob Pulford sits down with all 6 owners and says, look, we don't want to be in a situation where you guys take any action against players who voted for the union. We want to make sure you guys recognize the union because it's here and it's here to stay. It's not going anywhere this time. And so the owners probably reluctantly agreed to it, right? So at this point, Jim Norris isn't running the whole thing. There's a whole chapter in Net Worth on Jim Norris and on his basically running hockey in the U.S. and how he viewed hockey and all of that fun stuff. And he loved hockey. He really did. But the reality was that now you have a union. And since then, we've seen salaries go up. Now, salaries didn't just jump overnight either. Basically, the WHA came in as competition for the National Hockey League and started throwing money at star players because that's the only way to get them to sign up with a startup league. Nobody's just going to go to a startup league without getting more money. So they get guys like Bobby Hull and other star players out of the National Hockey League, Davey Keon, and all of a sudden, owners in the NHL have to either pay their players a decent living wage or they're going to go to the WHA. And so this is where the hatred the NHL had for the WHA started. They're being forced to pay their players more because there's some other startup league run by idiots that don't know how to make money that's forcing their bottom line to drop. Like their profits are going to drop because these players have to make actual money now. But eventually, of course, we know the WHA did fail because the business plan was not great. Just going to say it wasn't great. I've done videos on the WHA before. And so the NHL ends up absorbing 4 teams from the WHA. Sadly, not Houston or Cincinnati, because if we'd had Houston and Cincinnati join as well, I think that would have been great. But at any rate, the NHL absorbs those teams, punishes those teams as they come in. So stripping certain players away, like, oh, yeah, you guys are coming in, but that guy's going to Chicago. That one, he's going to Toronto. He's going to Philly, like just Rangers, wherever, because they wanted to make sure that these teams were a little bit weaker coming in, which, absolutely just destroyed the Winnipeg Jets right out of the gate. But one thing that was said in the book, and I wanted to write this on the board, no sport effortlessly controlled its athletes like hockey. So while other sports had other fights with their unions to be or unions that were in place, yeah, hockey players were very quiet. They were very modest. And players' inability to unionize probably cost them, in the book, it says $100 million. Between the formation of the league and when they finally get their union in 1967, the estimate is probably at least $100 million in benefits, pensions, everything else. They just didn't get it because they could not unionize. They couldn't get together. We still see that, right? We still see that fracturing during any kind of a lockout or shutdown. In 2020, during the pause, we saw certain players saying one thing and other players saying another. And there was some debate, like when they decided to return to hockey. Are they actually going to return? Is the union going to agree? Are we going to see a bunch of players say, yeah, screw this, I'm not going back? Like there was some concern, and that's always been a thing with hockey. The players don't necessarily agree with or get along with one another. And so owners can get in there, right? So back before you had a union, an owner could sit down with, say, an Eddie Shore and say, look, Eddie, I think you're doing a great job. The guys really would like to get a union going, and I just wanted to let you know that's probably going to affect your pay too. Like I mean, if the union comes in, I'm going to have to pay them more. You're probably going to get less. So then you're taking that player who's making more money, and he's going to go to his teammates and go, look, guys, we can't unionize. I'm not going to vote for it. And then what's to stop that owner from going to other players and just picking them off one by one? Before you know it, players aren't going to vote for the union. So one thing that definitely adds to the idea that, well, players are greedy. Players are greedy is the strikes and the lockouts. Now, some say it's all Bettman's fault. Not really, because the owners at any point in time could say, Gary, we need to get back to work. Sit down and work this out. And that really hasn't happened for the most part because Bettman's got his marching orders from the owners. This is what we want. So 1992, the players went on strike. It is the only time the players have initiated a strike. And it lasted roughly 30 days. The NHL, got that done. But the NHL at that point, it felt like the owners said, okay, all right, the players want to go on strike. Their union wants certain benefits and whatnot. Cool. All right. So we're just going to lock them out then. So 94-95, we had a lockout shortened season. 2012-2013, we had a lockout shortened season. 94-95, there was talk then of a salary cap. The owners really wanted cost certainty. That was the big phrase, cost certainty. We're losing money here. We're losing money. And again, as I've said, if a business gives a guy $6 million as a salary when they can't afford to pay it, is it really the fault of the guy that signed the contract to take that $6 million? Or is it the fault of the employer that offered him the $6 million? So people get sold on the idea that, well, the league's losing money because the players are greedy, when that's not exactly the case. And there are definitely teams that spend money that they don't have, right? We will see that on July 1st. We see that very often in free agency, where teams that may not be making a lot of money then go out and sign guys to big contracts. So 94-95, they don't get their salary cap, and I think that stuck with the owners. I think the owners were kind of ticked off about that, right? Bettman was still getting familiar with the job. He'd only been on the job for about a year. And he and Bob Goodnow had a decent relationship at the beginning, I thought, at least publicly. But 04-05, the owners dug in. The owners basically, we're not going back without a cap. And the players said, we're not going to play under a salary cap. There's no way. There's no chance. Well, when you've got millionaires and billionaires holding out, who's going to give in first? Who's going to blink? The millionaires, right? And in the case of players, we talk about them being millionaires. Not all of them are. Your entry-level guys aren't. And so a lot of players don't make enough money to afford to sit out multiple seasons. So after that first year's gone and all that money's gone, they sit down and they agree to that salary cap. And the agreement to the salary cap, that caused some issues, right? And so union heads had to go. Things had to change. But the owners got their wish, right? I think it was 54% initially was going to the players and 46% to the owners. Then the owners decided, that's not enough. We didn't get enough money. So we got our salary cap, but we'd like a 50-50 split. And we'd like some more concessions from the players. So we have the 2012-2013 lockout where they got more concessions from the players. And it was interesting because, this was a lockout that wasn't that long after that lost season of 04-05. There was a lot of discussion during the 2012-2013 lockout among fans that they were going to boycott. Fans are going to boycott. The NHL is going to regret this. The NHL is going to lose so much money. The NHL is in such deep trouble. We are not going back. These owners are so greedy. And then the attendance was fantastic upon the NHL's return. Fans were so excited and ecstatic. It was a 48-game season. It was a tremendous playoffs. And all of that was kind of forgotten by fans. We always threaten to boycott. We never really do. And the funny thing is the players have a lot of power, but so do fans, if fans ever decided to, get together and discuss things. But when fans take sides, very often it's with the owners, which is odd to me. The idea that, players should get paid fair compensation. Without a union, fair compensation becomes whatever the owner thinks fair compensation is, right? Without some kind of a minimum amount that a player should be paid, they can say, I'll give you 50 grand. All right, well, you don't want to play for 50 grand? All right, you're out the door, which some people are perfectly fine with. But if history has shown us anything with the National Hockey League, the union has meant that players actually get paid what they're worth. And again, it's interesting that 50% of the league's revenues go to 32 men. The other 52% or the other 50% gets divided amongst 600 or 700 players, and those players are called greedy. That's one of my favorite things that I always kind of shrug my shoulders at because, they're making a lot of money. And what we've seen with the Ottawa Senators sale, now there's a minority owner of the Tampa Bay Lightning looking to sell his share of the team because that share of the team is now worth a lot more money. He can sell, he can get out. He can make a lot of money on that sale. We're probably going to see other owners just at least looking at the valuation of their franchise. And Forbes, when they do their valuations, I believe those come out in November, we're going to see those franchises worth a lot more money, which, means more status for those owners, more money for those owners, and more ability to spend more money. But as long as we as fans buy into this idea that hockey players are really greedy, when for at least the first 60 years the NHL's in existence, players really weren't paid what I think they would have been worth. If it was a 50-50 split in revenues the whole way through, we wouldn't have seen that explosive growth in salaries in the early 70s that was then repeated in the late 80s as well, right? And yes, eventually there were teams that spent more than they could afford, but at least now ticket prices are a lot higher so they can afford it. Because in the end, when 0405 was around, Gary Bettman sat in front of a microphone and said, we're doing this to try to keep ticket prices down too. If the players get what they want, our customers are going to be paying so much more for tickets, and that's not fair. Last time I looked, ticket prices are a lot higher than they were in 2004, and I have never heard an owner say, we would really like to lower our ticket prices because our fans, gosh darn it, they deserve it. No, they're businessmen. They're in it to make money. And that was the reason for the lockouts and the lost season, which was after the players said, hey, we're going to go on strike. We've had enough of this. So I do expect that as we get closer to the end of the current CBA, which is 2026 or 2027, looks like it'll be 2026, that we'll start hearing that ramp up again. We'll start hearing about, we're not making as much money as we thought we were, or something along those lines, right? Because it happens every time. And there will always be fans that fall for it because we are sold this idea that players are really greedy. The whole, well, doctors don't get paid that. Well, I agree, but that they're not connected to each other at all. There is no connection whatsoever. And I would imagine team doctors are paid pretty well. So that being said, let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. And remember, when people say, I miss when hockey players just played for the love of the game, so do the owners. They really miss when players would go out there and sacrifice their body, their future, and their health and not care about the money. They really miss that because then that meant more money for them. Thank you guys so much for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.